so I'm going to go ahead and record. And since we're early, I was going to give people a minute, but if you guys are okay, I'll go ahead and get started. So for those that don't know, I know most of you here, but I am a climatologist with OSU Extension. And so for the last few years, I've been providing weather and climate information throughout the state, farmers, educators, specialists, and anyone who will listen. You know, we all talk about weather. We all chit chat about weather. It's something obviously dear to my heart, and I'm very passionate about what happens in Ohio. So it's an honor to be here to discuss kind of the weather update with this group, both where we've been and also where it looks like we're heading. So just to start off, we'll kind of rewind the clock a bit, and we'll go back to the winter. If you felt that it was a warm winter, indeed it was. It was the 5th warmest on record for the state of Ohio, and that's really what the map up here on the right-hand side is showing. And by 5th warmest, I mean it's the 5th warmest since 1895. So we've got very robust records across the state going back to 1895. So we consider that the modern period. And over that period, again, it was the 5th warmest December through February. And you can see our temperatures were generally 2 to maybe 6 or 7 degrees in some spots. If you're down along the Ohio River, it was more like 6-7 degrees above average. And then north central Ohio, we had a warmer than average spot as well. So basically, just the entire region, the Midwest region, was above average. We were wetter than average as well. This is looking at the accumulated precipitation for those 3 months compared to a 30-year mean, what the National Weather Service calls normal. So when you hear above or below normal, that's generally what they mean. What were the conditions between 1981 and 2010, and how does this compare? So much above average along the eastern and southeastern counties, and also in west central Ohio, and a bit above average in other places. So for the state, this was the 22nd wettest on record back to 1895. So wet and warm is what we had for the winter time this season. So we got into March, and really much of that same story continued. This is the departure or difference between our daytime highs and the normal highs for this time of the year on the left-hand side, and also our overnight lows on the right-hand side. So warm everywhere. We had the 11th warmest March on record here for the state, both highs and lows, so very warm conditions, and very wet conditions across the central portion of the state. So on the left-hand side, this is the accumulated precip for the month of March, and you see from Franklin over to Licking counties, and then up into the east, you see some 10 to 12 and a half inches, or between 7.5 and between 7.5 and upwards of 12 inches in some localized spots just for the month of March. And that's well above average, more than double in that strip. So if you remember last season, you know, we had a situation where Northwest Ohio was very saturated, especially as we got later into spring, April and May. East Central Ohio was sort of the sweet spot. Perfect amount of rainfall. Well, we've sort of flipped the switch a little bit, or flipped the map over a little bit in terms of, you know, up to this point, the Northwest Ohio has been adequately wet, maybe a little bit dry in the long term, but not dry, you know, as we would think of it in terms of a drought or anything at this point, while the wetter conditions have kind of been south of there. So as we look at the more recent changes and the more recent temperatures that we've seen, you know, we had a very warm weekend, a couple of days, you know, a lot of places across the state hit 80 degrees for the first time this month. And where it was a bit drier, where it has been a bit drier, temperatures were actually a little bit above average for this past week for the whole. You know, I know it's been chill, a little bit cooler over the longer term, but still with those very warm conditions a couple of days last week, that really sent our differences compared to this time of the year, typically a little bit above average. Where it was wetter, we were cooler than average. Certainly over the last 30 days, what's different than the winter and different than March is that April was cooler than average, generally 2 to 5 degrees across the state cooler than average. So you think about, you know, this warm winter, this warm March, we've got advanced phenological states. We were starting the spring with really warm temperatures, or warmer, about 10 degrees above average on soil temperatures. So it looked like things were going to advance. And then pretty quickly. And then we had this cooler weather during April, which really kind of put the brakes on a lot of things. One of the things that we were watching was alfalfa weevil, for instance, with the warm winter. You know, we had very high numbers just coming into April that haven't advanced that much. So usually the 300 growing degree day, which is what the map is showing here, is kind of like that signal of active feeding that could be an issue. So we're starting to get that now over the southern, probably half to 2/3 of the state, where we're getting into that time for active alfalfa weevil here based on the conditions that we're seeing. As far as precipitation goes, this past week, again, Northwest Ohio, very limited precipitation. I haven't heard a lot of complaints yet as far as that goes, just because soils are fit and folks are getting out and getting into the fields. Elsewhere, you know, we're still dealing with some heavier precipitation. We had this line of showers and thunderstorms really kind of train, which means they move over the same areas here across southern counties. They drop 2 to 4 inches Sunday morning. So if we compare that to average, again, over the last week, much below average precip in the Northwest, and then increasingly till we get well above average across our southeastern counties. So we've got a wet south and a dry Northwest this year. And that's really been the pattern for a while now. So this is the last 30 days. Again, you know, dry conditions about or less than half the normal precip across the northern counties, whereas across basically along and south and east of I-71 here, we've had almost double the amount of normal precipitation over the last 30 days. So that's kind of the situation that we're heading in. So what is that? How's that impacting some other things that we think about? So first, soil moisture. You know, when we think about May last year in Northwest and West Central Ohio, we were talking 26 days of at least a trace of precipitation. So if you live there, you know. And that's not certainly something that we've seen now. We've seen much drier conditions. So if we look at the soil moisture, a lot of our West Central counties and Northwest counties are in that 30 to 70th percentile ranking, which is considered normal, right? So we've got soil moisture that's adequate, but it's not on the dry side. It's not on the surplus side, unlike our eastern counties here, where some places are now above that 95th or 99th percentile, very saturated soil conditions on the historical record. I mentioned the soil temperatures. You know, we started out early in the season with really soil temperatures already at or above 50 degrees. These are various locations across Ohio. So kind of a west central, southwest here. We've got our northern stations here, central locations to northeast station, and then our southern station here at Piketon. You know, we were kind of already in the 50s heading into April, and then we had this big cool down. Most of the soil temperatures, we lost about 10 degrees. We were actually at Northwest dipping back down. So up here in Northwest Ohio, dipping back down into the 30s even that third week of April. And then we've steadily increased now. Once we get into May, you know, we've got a sun angle that's as strong as early August, right? So you think about that strength of the sun, it's equivalent to that August sun. So all of that energy that's being absorbed at the surface is really pushing those temperatures up, despite some cooler air temperatures. So for instance, if we're looking at Piketon down here, you know, the red bar is the air temperature, much cooler than the soil temperature. How does the soil temperature continue to warm? It's that strong sun, right? Pumping that radiation into the soil, and it can continue to warm. So that's kind of the conditions with the soil moisture and the soil temperatures. Now, one of the other things that we've had to deal with this season, you know, one of the long-term changes we've seen are kind of this period in February where we warm up. We call them fall springs. We get these warm Februaries, and then it makes us more susceptible to late season freezes. Well, with the advanced winter and March conditions that we have, it's similar. And now in April, we dealt with 3 major freeze events across the state that's done some horticultural damage, you know, some loss of peaches, though it seems like it's basically just going to lessen the amount of pruning that needed to take place. But for other things like pawpaws, right, that are kind of a big deal across southeastern Ohio, lost much of those. We haven't seen a lot of impact on forages or wheat and things like that, just a little bit burn tipped. But, you know, we had 3 what I would consider late season freezes in April. So what these maps are showing you now is, one on the left, this is the late freeze. This would be considered a 1 in 10 year event. So for much of Ohio, 1 in 10 year event would be anything that occurs where you hit a 28 degree Fahrenheit temperature after April. The only May is up here around the Worcester and that valley, and then farther northeast up into Ashtabula, Trumbull counties, where it's not as unheard of to have 28-degree temperatures in May. The one on the right, the figure on the right, this is the latest 28 degree. And again, much of that southwest portion of Ohio is in, by April 30th, this is the latest 28-degree day that we've experienced. And across northern Ohio, again, that's more like the first 10 days or 11 days, 12 days of May. Okay, so just keep that in mind based on the forecast I'm going to show you. This is for 32 degrees. Now, this time of year, we always say, hey, Mother's Day is a good mark for absolutely no freezes. And that's generally the case, though. If you look at the right-hand side, the latest 32 degree that's ever occurred really pushes toward the end of the month, wherever you see these light blue colors, right? So it's not unheard of to see these light freezes or frost conditions throughout the month of May, okay? So just to contextualize this, we don't often see the 28-degree days, but 32 degrees isn't that uncommon even in May for much of the state. So what are we looking at? Today we've got these lingering showers that are kind of moving through the area. Some of our northern locations, if you're up there, maybe you saw some frozen precipitation yesterday. We saw some what we call grapple, just frozen conglomerates basically around the region. Maybe you're seeing a few snow showers today. That's not going to be probably the last time some places in Ohio see that this week. We head in tomorrow. Tomorrow's a great day. Highs should be in the low 60s to mid 60s, upper 60s across the state, a little bit cooler across the north and the south. And then we're going to have another system move in here on Friday and Friday night, and end early Friday night. That again is going to be rain showers and then maybe a little bit of snowflakes, especially in that northeast quadrant of Ohio Friday. And then what I'm worried about, what I'm really concerned about is, we might see some frost around the state tonight. We might see some frost tomorrow night as well if skies clear out. But Friday night and Saturday morning, I'm really concerned about a major freeze event. We've got a very strong high pressure system that's moving in. Once that system moves out, if we get clear skies Friday night and Saturday morning, I would imagine we'll see a lot of Ohio into the mid to upper 20s, especially the eastern counties, and then south of Columbus, and then maybe over to like Clinton, Fayette, that kind of area. We could see some mid to upper 20s. That's obviously going to pose a problem for wheat that's in stage 7, stage 8. It's going to pose a problem for some flowering trees that are still out there, or fruit and that sort of thing. So just something to keep in mind. And then from a gardening perspective, some of the things that have been planted, vegetables, landscape, there may be some things that really need to be covered. I'm growing concerned about Saturday morning for a major freeze event here as our forecast moves along. We're not expecting a tremendous amount of rainfall over the next 7 days, generally about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch across southern counties, less than that across the north. So kind of this continued pattern of dry northern Ohio, wetter southern Ohio, but all of this is under the typical amount that we see for this time of year. Going out even farther now, looking at the 6 to 10 day outlook, and these are the latest NOAA Climate Prediction Center outlooks. And the way these work is based on probability. Model forecast, if I were to give you what the temperature is expected a week from today, the skill of being able to tell you exactly what the temperature is pretty low, right? We have good confidence in our day-to-day forecast out to about 5 days. Beyond that, we're really looking at trends, okay? So don't let anybody fool you. We do well out to 5 days. Beyond that, we do trends well. So we can look at overall weather patterns. We can see we've got really strong confidence that we're going to linger with this cooler air, cooler than average temperatures through at least the middle part of May. So even after we get through this weekend, this is not likely to end. Now, doesn't mean that we're going to be that I can predict a deep freeze again next week. No, that's not the case. But we should be, really for this period, May 11th through the 15th, we should see highs in the upper 60s in northern Ohio, low 70s across southern Ohio, with overnight lows in the 40s. We're expecting cooler than this. We're expecting highs generally in the 50s with overnight lows in the 30s. Precipitation, though, again, we're not looking for any huge impulses of extremely wet conditions. So we're expecting conditions to be close to average over the first half of the month, maybe slightly drier than average, especially across the northern area. And one thing that I want to just keep in mind, this isn't to kind of, well, I'll hold this for one of my next slides here. So if we look at overall May, we're expecting by the time we get to the end of the month that May will have been another cooler than average month, much like April was. It doesn't mean it'll be as cold as April, but we will be below average. And then we're likely to see drier conditions, especially across the northern tier. And again, a flag goes up for me, because if we've got extended dry period in April and May, and for those that have heard me talk, just because we're in a condition now in the long term where we've seen a wet year after year, it doesn't mean that we don't see drought conditions. You know, last year we had drought conditions in a year where we went back to back, wettest 12-month periods on record. We know droughts are still part of our weather story. If we continue to be dry, once that heat cranks up, and that's what I'm afraid of, we're just going to flip a switch here. We're going to turn hot. Soils are going to be dry. We need to be thinking about the Northwest counties and the potential that has also to flip very quickly. Now, it's not something I think we can control for right now, but it's just something in the back of our, back of the mind, and something that I'm watching from a meteorological perspective to think about. We don't anticipate this because we do expect an active wet pattern through much of the planting and early part of the growing season here through July. So that would be good news. But if you've ever heard the term drought begets drought, there's a reason for that. Once you start drying out those soils, if you get your temperatures warming up, it kind of prevents those storms from happening. So we just got to be mindful here. But generally, the outlook is for warmer than average and wetter than average conditions throughout our summer. When I say warmer than average, not necessarily our daytime highs being really warm. What we've seen and our long-term observations are our overnight lows stay warmer than average, but our daytime highs not necessarily so. Okay. So that's something to think about as well. I'm going to skip this slide. It's just basically talking about the chances of what's called an El Nino or La Nina INSO conditions.
Yeah.
We are expecting La Nina conditions, we think, to form later this fall. Basically, what that means for Ohio is in the tropical Pacific, we have sea surface temperatures. When they're cooler than average or warmer than average, they have certain effects on our overall weather pattern. So with cooler than average conditions, what we expect are wet late falls into winter. So that's really what my message is here today, is just to think about, once we get into the fall and we're thinking about harvesting, one of the things that we're going to see start to develop in the fall are wetter conditions across the northern tier of the U.S., drier across the southern tier of the U.S., if the La Nina does develop. So our late fall and our winter conditions are usually pretty wet here in Ohio. So that's all I had to present to you today. I think we have a couple of minutes left. I do provide a kind of a Southwest Central Ohio forecast on my Facebook, but more broadly across Ohio, Twitter, there's my Twitter, you can always contact. A weekly hydroclimate outlook as well at climate.osu.edu, a video, and push those out through social media. And you can always email me if you have any questions. So as we continue to live out our Groundhog Days here, I thought it appropriate to use my picture of my favorite weatherman here, and I'll open it up for any questions as we've got about a minute and a half left. So thank you. Any questions, concerns, discussion, thoughts? So Ben, I heard earlier that you were talking about South America. La Nina conditions for South America also turn wet from June through March. So that's something to.
It'd be a wet winter for them then, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Yeah. We've seen some rains the last couple of weeks. I don't know if you've tracked that. They've had some rains the last couple of weeks. It's still missing that southern portion of Brazil. What about, just out of curiosity, have you looked at like Eastern Europe, Western Asia, that Ukraine?
No, not a close look.
Sea, okay.
But I wrote it down. I wrote it down listening to yours that I was going to go take a look.
Yeah. No worries. I was just curious.
So Beth, you're in Northwest Ohio. Any perspectives this year compared to last year? Do you want to share?
Oh, we are dry compared to last year, and we've had a lot of planting going on. So, you know, it's just been a blessing compared to where we were last year. So, yeah, completely